Hello, sorry for the delay. Obviously, Jordan is on vacation. Thanks for joining Office Hours. I'm Chris. I'll be filling in. Um, so if you have any questions, please post to Slack, please post to the YouTube channel, and I'll jump right in. So we have a couple questions in Slack that came in this morning that I think I'll just start with those. So the first question from Fast Break 10 in Slack. Oh man, that's a long one. Bear with me. So when I look at Fantasy Labs for contest reports, consistently shows that 40 to 60% of the top 1% lineups are spending their full salary. As you move down in salary, the percentage of the top lineups goes down. I know we've gotten questions similar to this in the past. I think it's kind of an interesting one that comes up every once in a while. And I think the idea that obviously higher salary lineups are going to be stronger on average as you use more of the salary, assuming that the pricing from whatever site you're playing on is decent. Those lineups are going to project better. The other element to this is that whenever you see a statistic about like the top lineups use this salary or this stack type or players of certain price, that is a reflection largely of what the field is doing, not necessarily what is optimal. So having lineups that let's see, I'll just show it a little bit. So sorry, 1 second. Here we go. Learning curve, getting back into it. All right, so let's just build a little lineup really here. Run a build for an example. Come on. But when you think about lineups that use more salary, when most of the top lineups are close to that 50K range, most of the people that are entering lineups are using the max salary. So it would make sense that you would see that just kind of as a base rate. But as you have players ruled out, news changes, projections change, that doesn't necessarily, of course, my computer wants to catch on fire. That doesn't necessarily mean that using all the salary is going to be optimal. So I'm going to run a build. We'll check out the projections for different lineups, see what we get relative to salary, and we can see, like, does this make sense? Are these lineups still strong, even though they're well below our max? So you can see right here, the min is at 59. Just for like demonstration, it might not do anything, but I'll just lower it to 50, just so we see what happens. But this is kind of along the same theme of, like, in NFL, you'll hear people talk about a certain stack type is near the top, a certain quarterback price is near the top of GPPs most of the time. And while there is some element to that being, I think, predictive of success, I think a lot of that is also simply due to that's what that portion of the field is doing strategically. So right away we see our top lineup here. I'll just do it by projected score also to try and see what we get. So really interesting. These slates right now, especially with all the roster changes going on, like salary is it's almost maybe hurting you more than helping you to try and use your max salary. So our top lineup projected score 314.9, salary of 59.5K. And when you look at these players in this lineup and their projections, none of those stand out to me as like inherently terrible. Like I would totally play that lineup. Down here, next one, 58.9, 59.2. There's a 60, 60, 59.9, 59.9, 59.9, 59.4. So while there are obviously very strong lineups close to that cap, there's also really strong lineups that are materially below it. And those are lineups that like the field might be avoiding because the way people have their settings calibrated, the way people's biases play into it, they always kind of default to spending more money versus less money. And on like a slate like today, 7-game main slate, I wouldn't be too worried about like duplicates, but on another slate, like if you were playing a 2, 3, or 4-game slate and you were forcing all of your lineups to use the maximum salary, your rate of duplicates would go way up. And the lineups that you would be avoiding would be comparable in projection, but actually better from a GPP standpoint because they would be way less duplicated, probably carry lower ownership compared to max salary lineups that were still unique. So while salary is, obviously it's an important element of DFS, I wouldn't use it as kind of like a variable in terms of like influencing your decisions like when it comes to using all of your salary. Like I don't think that's a goal you want to have. If it happens, that's great. If it doesn't, then that might actually be a good thing. So hopefully that answers your question. Let's see what else we have here. Yeah, but I appreciate any of the questions. And obviously, Jordan is on a well-deserved vacation. He is a total pro at this. I'm going to do my best to kind of fill in and get into the swing of things, but I'm a little rusty, so I appreciate the patience. So we have another question in Slack from Larson407. This is a good question. See how many messages this turns into. All right, I'll read it as well. So I find that the sim seems to double down on certain players. Last night I was getting a ton of AD in my early builds. The issue I have is what max ownership should I put on a player in stage 1 that the sims really like? Is there a point where he's such a great value because of injury, etc., that I should let the sim control it to 100%? Should I never be more than double the field on a standard player if the sim is putting it in a ton of lineups? So there's a couple questions in that. I'll try and kind of like break it down. So this, you will definitely see that like depending on the slate, I could go back to yesterday and run a build, see what happens. It probably won't give that much AD, but who knows? There will probably be different variables and changes given how, like I said, the rosters right now are just crazy. It makes late swap in NBA very interesting. But I think like when you're getting 100% of some player, what SaberSim is telling you is that the that player fits into a lot of lineups that just project and rank very well based on your sliders and everything else that goes into it. So it could be that those lineups that all had AD, those might have been your highest EV lineups, basically. And so let's see, only have 18% Davis by default, but 70% LeBron. So that's kind of an interesting flip. Those lineups, having 100% of a player should be plus EV if that player projects well relative to their salary and ownership. The flip side of that is that you often in DFS and tout land, you'll hear people say, such and such is a lock. And in NBA, I think that's very common because you'll have some smash value play that's just way, way too cheap. Everybody knows it. But if you're going to play if you know the field is playing 100% of somebody, then you don't want to play any of them, even if they are a great value. That's just game theory strategy right there. But that never happens that someone is literally 100% by the field. So that kind of goes out the window. The next thing is that if you're playing 100% of somebody, that might be the highest EV strategy in the long run. It's also a very high risk, high variance strategy. So I think it comes down to sort of a risk tolerance, and also maybe there's a bankroll management consideration. How much of your bankroll are you playing? Are you super conservative on a slate? Are you playing every slate on the day, or are you just playing the main slate? If you're a little more aggressive with your bankroll and you're just playing the main slate, then you might not want to have 100% of someone. Me personally, I play pretty conservative bankroll, just allocation to each specific slate, but then I play all the slates on a day. So I'm totally fine going 100%. So for this main slate, the build I ran, obviously this is retroactive, so things are going to be a little funny, but LeBron, 70%. If he had been 100%, I think what I would do is I would look, first of all, I would just go in here, look at projection, and I would see, so who else is up there near the ceiling? LeBron, AD, LaMelo. There's kind of a bunch of people in this mid 40s range, but LeBron and AD are the two that are kind of, have a gap to everybody else. And they're also pretty big salary gap over most of those players down below also. So I think what I would do here is look at the other options near that projection range and that salary range. And you can see right away. So if LeBron projects higher than AD, but he's also cheaper, he's going to be way less popular and lower owned, for good reason. The other side of that, though, of course, is that we know that LeBron and AD both have very high ceilings and could easily be the highest scoring player on the slate. And so let's look at what are our lineups with LeBron? What do they look like? So one here projected for 316, 319, 331, 324. Of course, this is all by Saber score. 314, 320. There's a couple that have LeBron and AD, but I'm going to look at the lineups that just have AD and not LeBron and see kind of what they look like. So 314, 311, 318, 316, 308. I'm curious what it looks like if we sort by projected score and look at the two of them. So The AD lineups are all mid to high teens, 315 plus. The LeBron lineups, 331, 327, 324, 324, 323. So the LeBron lineups, you can see they consistently project you know, 5 to 10 points higher than the AD lineups. And there's only a 4-point difference between their projections. So what that's telling you is that there are positional elements there that make LeBron a better play than AD. So in that situation, I would just go with this and be okay with it, because I know those LeBron lineups on average are going to be quite a bit stronger than the AD lineups. So if I had done that though, and I saw that the AD lineups were projected for only like a point or two less than the LeBron lineups, because, you know, for whatever reason on this slate, we know that maybe there were other good options at power forward and center. So when you forced in AD, you took those out and you lost a lot of projection. But at small forward, there weren't as many good options. So LeBron is a very strong play and just leads to better lineups overall. But if that wasn't the case, and those AD lineups had been comparable in projection, even though he is lower, has a lower projection than LeBron, I probably would have gone in here and maybe, so what, their total ownership or my total exposure to the two of them right now is 78%. So what I might do here is I would just lower maybe LeBron to 45, see what that does to AD. It might not do anything. Lowered him to, or increased him to 24. I think I might increase him to 30. And if like I said, this is hypothetical, where if I knew that LeBron was a better play than AD, but the lineups that contained AD were just a little worse than LeBron and he was lower owned, and I know they have a pretty similar ceiling, then I would lower that player that I had, you know, the highest exposure to, like 100%, for instance, like you were saying yesterday, and kind of raise the other alternatives at that projection range or that salary range, that position, whoever it is that you're kind of weighing your options. It's always about like opportunity cost in DFS. So you need to, if you want to raise or lower a player, you're doing the opposite to somebody else, even if you're not looking at it directly. So before you make changes like that, I think it's always a good idea just to look at the other options, see, you know, what is the kind of unintended consequence of making this change, and am I okay with that? So hopefully that kind of like answers your question and gets to kind of the principle of it, because like on a slate by slate basis, there's always so many considerations. It's hard to know, you know, exactly what to do. But I think the idea of just comparing that player to the alternatives and what does it look like when you have less of them, what does it look like when you have more of them, and making your decision just based on the information and the lineups you see based on that specific slate is kind of the right way to go about it, instead of just using kind of blanket rules to lower your exposure. So before this gets buried in the chat, I'm going to go back to that YouTube channel and find, Chris, tell us your NBA DFS strategy. That's pretty much it. So that's from Eamon Worldwide. I am a very low touch NBA player. I think like understanding what goes into the sims and the projections and like all of the work that the team does from Matt and Will and Eric on the model side, like the stuff that they're doing to kind of get the baseline that we build lineups from is so good and so impressive that like I don't want to mess it up. So I make very delicate, kind of gentle changes like I just showed. Like there are times where I will run a build and do nothing and upload those lineups and then just come back and late swap. But doing nothing it's not my strategy. It's like a choice. So I'm looking at my lineups. I'm seeing what kind of exposures I got, what alternatives look like in different situations, kind of like looking at that LeBron versus AD thing, and then thinking, am I okay with this? Or do I want to make any changes to lower my risk or get a little more contrarian? If there are opportunities to do that where I don't think I lose much upside or projection, I will. But for the most part, I just make a couple little tweaks and roll with it. I've been playing around with the new groups rules a little bit. Those are cool. I like kind of using those at the start to build my lineups, to kind of make sure I have lineups that are, at least at the start, kind of structured to do well on average. And then as the slate goes on, I'll kind of remove those rules if good late swap opportunities pop up. Yeah, that's pretty much. Well, actually, there's one other thing. So this slate yesterday is actually a good, I think, opportunity to check this out. So with that slate yesterday, we had one game at 4 o'clock. I'm West Coast, so bear with me on the times. So one game at 4 o'clock, one game at maybe it was 4, but there was only one game right at o'clock. And it was a slate where we knew there were going to be a lot of or at least there was the potential for a lot of uncertainty in the late games with people being ruled out, like we had on the Lakers. What LeBron and Westbrook were both questionable. No one was sure if neither would play, if one would play but not the other, if who would be out. On the Kings, you had a bunch of questionable players. Obviously, I'm not always set up to stream because this is challenging my computer the way Jordan doesn't have to deal with it. But so in these late games, we had, first of all, we knew this Chicago-Charlotte game was going to be really popular because there was a lot of value in that game. And in the Minnesota-Sacramento game, there were a lot of questionable players and the potential for great value to open up with late swap. In the Lakers-Portland game, same thing. In the San Antonio-Cleveland game at the start, I think there was a little bit of opportunity with, I believe it was both Garland and Goodwin were both potentially going to be out. But instead, Garland ended up playing. LeVert is now active. So when you look at these two teams, there are some projections, in the high 30s and 40s. Let's look at the value. The best value was Okoro at 5.99, and then a bunch of people 5 and under. If we look at the slate altogether and look at value, so Okoro was right here, 5th overall, but there were a ton of players at a similar value or higher at a much higher raw projection. And so I made the decision that the only player I would really be excited to play from this first game was Okoro. But at the same time, he's only projected for 20 points. The chances he goes off for some crazy score is very low. He ended up scoring 25. That's solid. But you definitely didn't need that to win. And so what I did to kind of preserve optionality and give myself more opportunity to swap later on is I just excluded this game and built my original lineups. This is my build right here that I uploaded to the slate. And so I actually built my lineups after lock, my original lineups. I just had um, in FanDuel, I believe I just had, a placeholder that excluded this first game. Um, and so like my reasoning for that was just that in this first game, one, it's kind of a low total, which like it's all factored in the projections, but it's a low total. There's only one player from that game that I would really be excited to have in my lineups. And if I play people from that game, I'm losing optionality later on for better plays that will potentially be lower owned. So since there's very little to gain, the only thing that I was really losing was Okoro, who's a good value, but a very pretty low upside player. Um, I would be losing access to him and everyone else from that game, but I gain optionality later when these 3 7 o'clock games roll around. Like think about on Minnesota, Edwards and D'Angelo Russell were both questionable, but ended up playing. I believe Beverly was questionable also and didn't play. But if 2 or 3 of those guys had been out, if they had been ruled out closer to lock, then like all of the other players on Minnesota would have just become absolute smashes. And if I had taken up spots with people from this first game, then I'd have way less swap opportunity and way less upside to gain from that news. So I think that's one like just kind of strategic way you can go about late swap. So hopefully that's just the rundown of my NBA strategy. It's like I said, it's very hands off because I have a lot of confidence in the baseline that the models and the optimizer gives me, just based on like knowing how good it really is and how much goes into it. I just don't want to mess that up. So let's see. We have another question that came in from YouTube. So from Eric. So lately I've been finding that the late slates have been better. I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong on the main slates, but all week's been kind of rough. So I also, honestly, I tend to do better on smaller slates than I do on larger slates. I think the way I play with very little intervention in terms of building lineups, I think that lends itself to utilizing sim variance to the fullest when on those small slates, because like SaberSim is great for showdowns. It's great for small slates like 2, 3, 4 games because it just will use that sim variance and find that subset of simulations to build those lineups that people just don't think about that are still very strong. And I think like depending on your strategy for those smaller slates, SaberSim just puts you in like a really, really good place to succeed, where you can get different in ways that are still very, very strong without like hurting yourself too much. So I think like on a main slate, if you do a lot of adjustments, you can kind of dig yourself into a hole without realizing it, just based on like the unintended consequences. It's kind of like going back to the LeBron and AD thing, where if I had just looked at those two players and seen, well, AD is only projected for like 5 fewer points. I know they have a similar ceiling. Why don't I just like make my exposure to both of them the same, or fade LeBron and play AD because AD is going to be way lower owned? Well, if you do that on the main slate, I think you can really fall behind because of like the unintended consequences of what that does to your lineups in terms of the other players that you're not thinking about. On a small slate, chances are when you make those kind of adjustments, you are doing it in a way where you're not going to put yourself like too far behind the field, because if you fade that highest projected player, or if you make some adjustments, your lineups, the player pool is so small, your lineups aren't going to fall that far behind, because you're not forcing out, there's not a bunch of like really high value plays that you are accidentally excluding from your lineups. You're sacrificing points for ownership and leverage, and it's pretty straightforward on a small slate. Whereas like on a main slate, when you do that, you just you lose a lot of upside without realizing it, because of the like butterfly effects of all the plays. So I hope that makes sense. I think it's really hard to kind of nail down the cause, especially with like the variance in DFS, without how that happens. But I don't know. I'll go look at today's slate and see if I can find an example. Can't remember if I ran a build for this or not. But there's 7 games, so there should be a small slate also. So let's see. So this was just, what did I do? 150, 10 to 50K. So you see here that like my exposures are pretty spread out. So I guess this early in the day, this is very subject to change. So this might be a bad example, but if I go to, or I'll go to the after hours, because they always have 150 max contests for those, but NBA exclusively on FanDuel, so this might look a little foreign to everybody, but I think all the ideas still hold the same. So I'll just run something similar just to kind of see what sort of exposures we get on a small slate versus a big slate. I think this is kind of a key part of it that I didn't cover, but on a small slate, it's less common for there to be just a bunch of really, really good plays. It's kind of like there's some solid, maybe there's a 1 or 2 players where you're like, oh yeah, that person is obviously going to be really highly owned, and then everybody else is kind of like whatever. I think when you get into those slates where you're splitting hairs between like who to play, and there's not a bunch of obvious value like people love to jam in on a main slate, I think SaberSim is awesome for those kind of slates. So that's probably one element that is very critical that I should have like addressed in a more straightforward way. It's just that like when there isn't a whole bunch of really obvious value, that is great for both like in general DFS purposes, but also for SaberSim, because SaberSim's just great at capitalizing on those situations where like ownership is going to be kind of spread out, and maybe people don't build lineups in the way that they think they should, based on their intuition. So you see here that our exposures are definitely more concentrated, as you would expect, compared to the main slate, but our highest is 80%, and then 30, 40, 60, 70. But one really interesting thing that stands out to me right away is this value column, and our 4th highest exposed player is Damian Lee on Golden State Warriors, even though he's projected for 18 at a value under 4. I think this is probably like a great example of why SaberSim is awesome for these small slates, is that like I bet a lot of people wouldn't even have lineups that had Damian Lee in them on this slate, because like I don't know what the Warriors starting situation is tonight, but he's not a good value. He's not projected for any like shocking number of points. But he's super low owned. He has decent upside, and he probably. So let's see. Damian Lee's lineups projecting between like 270 to 280. Just curious to see what the lineups that don't have Lee look like. There's probably some fall off, but maybe not much. So that top lineup doesn't have him. That's a very strong lineup. And you can see that that was still our third ranked lineup by SaberScore. So that's in our build already. But 280, 279, 280, 280. So you don't sacrifice really a meaningful amount of projection to have Damian Lee in your lineups. Other than this number one lineup up here that's already in our build. So I think like this just highlights why SaberSim can really do well on those small slates, because like it says right here, ownership 0.4%. Like it's probably going to be higher than that. And like the slate, obviously it's going to change between now and 7 o'clock tonight. But like I would be totally fine playing 49% Damian Lee on a small slate, because when I look at the lineups, like I don't have any problem with this projection, first of all. And when I look at the lineups, those are very solid. Like I'm happy with those. So that's a great way to just kind of like get leverage on the field with lineups that still make sense. And I think that like I said, he won't be, I would be surprised if he was 0.4% owned, given the assumptions right now at this time of day. But he won't be high owned just because he doesn't project well. But based on like positional limitations and the other players on the slate, you can get very, very strong lineups with Lee in them. But like on a main slate, if you were putting in these type of players at that exposure level, the chances that like all of the high value chalk plays that you are foregoing to play this person, the chances that all of those fail and that your low owned, for 3.96 value player exceeds all of those, and you you managed to pass 99% of the field in that situation, but the chances that that happens are super, super slim. So, but on a small slate, like when there isn't obvious value or obvious obvious value or obvious chalk, especially like at the low salary range, that's just awesome. So, but like like I said, I play all of the slates when I play NBA, or at least all of the ones that I can. Like sometimes I'm not able to, just based on other responsibilities. But I like to play all the slates, kind of spread out my bankroll between those, because it gives you these opportunities to find like a Damian Lee with that kind of leverage, and to get different over the course of the night instead of just banking all in that main slate. So I would, if anybody's been having a rough go at NBA lately, like I would strongly encourage you to try to play the smaller slates as well, even if it's only a handful of lineups, and to like spread your bankroll between them. I know you can't always find contests that fit within like the effective entrance guidelines we use or that we recommend for contest selection, but I think that the added like diversification and ability to kind of like get more leverage points throughout the course of the night, and just increase your sample size so that you have a better opportunity to realize your edge, I think is great. And that extends to like even single game contests. But if you're going to play single game contests and multi-game contests, multi-game slates, then you definitely want to be super conservative in your bankroll, because there's a lot of correlation across all of those overlapping slates. So hopefully that's helpful versus that. See if I can find our next question. Demetrius, I'm not sure which video you're referring to, so I think you'll have to be a little more specific So just let me know if there's something that I'm missing. But we have a question. Let's see if anything came in on Slack. I'm just going to check. If you have any other questions, please just enter them in. I'm happy to answer. I'll do my best, of course. Jordan's level of expertise in this stuff is unmatched. The dude is a rock star and worked super hard to put this together. But well-deserved vacation for him, so I'm happy to fill in. But let's see what we got here. Edward, I see your question in Slack about an RPS partner function. I'll follow up with you outside of office hours because I think that'll just be more appropriate for all the viewers. So we're not covering a feature that only applies to a couple people. So if that's all right, I'll follow up with you after the stream's over. Let's see. I think we might be getting close. I'm going to scroll back through the chat, see if I missed anything. But I think actually, I have an idea here. So I love to play one game slates on FanDuel. And I think it's kind of like a great way to sort of demonstrate some of the ideas I was talking about earlier with like AD and weighing your options relative to the other players available on the slate. So let's see. And there's several pretty highly projected players on this slate also. So I think it'll be a useful demonstration. So now on FanDuel, there aren't even going to be any 150 max contests for this slate, but I think it'll still be kind of a cool little experiment. So when I run that 150 max build, you see right away. So FanDuel, if you're not familiar with it, has only 5 roster spots for the one game contest, but it has 3 different multiplier positions and 2 utility positions, which creates kind of like lots of different combinations of lineups you can get even from a smaller number of players per lineup. But so if we look at what I'm trying to see here and to demonstrate is just to like look at the players who projects to be kind of like the highest and you're getting the most exposure to them in that captain position, that multiplier position, that where you want that ceiling performance. So we have Jimmy Butler way up there, 63%, and then a bunch of people down here below. So on a slate like this, so all these Jimmy Butler lineups are going to project way better than everything else. All of the lineups that have Jimmy Butler at that MVP position. When you have, let's look at their non-multiplier projection. It might not even show up. Okay, so when you look at it this way, you see Ingram is projected for 6 fewer points, 7 fewer points, roughly, than Jimmy. Jonas Valanciunas a little lower, Bam a little lower, CJ a little lower, and then falls off a bit to Hero and Lowry. But like the funny thing is, we all know all the way down here to Lowry, probably, that all of these players, if you follow the NBA, if you ran like if I had ran a full test build, I might have gotten more exposure. But we know that all of these players definitely have an opportunity to be the highest scoring on the slate. And so those are kind of like what I am weighing my Butler exposure against. And so one thing that stands out to me right away is so these Bam, Jonas, and Brandon Ingram. Obviously, I have less exposure to them than to Jimmy, but I'm surprised how much they vary between each other. And when I look at the ownership, Ingram is the highest owned of these three, but he's only projected for a couple points more. Like, what I would probably do here is I would think that between Ingram and Valanciunas, I would want a little more Ingram, but I don't need 3 times as much Ingram. I might go for might cap him at 15 and raise Jonas to 10, just to kind of like, one, that kind of lowers my risk because I'm diversifying my exposures, but it also, I think, gives me opportunity for leverage, because based on our projections, at least, Ingram is going to be a lot higher owned than Jonas, and that, I think, it's reasonable to assume that applies to all of these positions. Now, when I look at Jimmy versus Ingram, well, and we can go down here. I think I would do something similar with Bam. Bam and Jonas I would want about the same as of those two. But with Jimmy, like, I know he has a much higher chance of being the best or the highest scoring player on the slate. But for a projection that is only, we go back here, he's 6 points, 7 points projected higher than Ingram when you don't have the multiple in place. So, like, how likely do I think it is that Jimmy outscores Ingram or Jonas or Bam? I would say it's pretty likely that one of those 3 players, I think there's a reasonable chance, like, I'll just rough estimate, I'll set his max at 50, because, like, my thought process is that of these 4 players kind of in this next range, I bet there's probably like a 50-50 chance that one of those 4 outscores Jimmy on the slate. And so even though those lineups don't project well, like, that's the alternative that I am weighing my Jimmy exposure against. And on single game slates, there's not as many of those like unintended consequences that you need to worry about, like on multi-game slates. But that was sort of like the crux of what I was trying to get at with the LeBron versus AD example earlier. It's all just like opportunity cost, alternatives, and how likely do you think it is that someone outscores the other, given the and in like this situation, like I said, where there's not a lot of trade-off that comes with just moving Jimmy from, you can have the exact same lineup and just put Jimmy at star instead of at MVP with the same players. So there's no trade-off. Versus like on a multi-game slate, when you are lowering your exposure to Jimmy, at small forward, like, there is a trade-off because you're getting more of somebody else and different lineups altogether. So that's kind of like just what hopefully that helps kind of illustrate that idea, that concept when adjusting your exposures. So let's see if anything else has come in. That might be it. Let's kind of stretching. Someone mentioned, is Kemba really chalk? I don't know. I haven't looked at the slate really, other than just for like demonstration purposes. And I bet I could go look at it now and build some lineups, and then in 2 or 3 hours, that none of that would matter. So I'm just gonna wait until later. Reserve my contests now, and then worry about slate specific stuff closer to lock. In general, I think that's kind of just a good way to approach NBA, so you don't get like too anchored to ideas you come across early in the day. because there's a really good chance it gets to be, 30 minutes before lock, and any of that stuff you were looking at, it might not be relevant anymore. So if you're going to do that, like, there's nothing wrong with it as long as you come at it with the approach that there's a high likelihood, if not a certainty, that this research I'm doing, this kind of analysis or thinking about who's good, who's a strong play, who's a bad play, there's a really, really good chance any of that done before lock is just pointless. And so if you want to do it, that's totally fine. But just remember, it's okay to change your mind. So you don't have to be stuck with that opinion that you came to it, 4 hours before lock. But I'm gonna glance over at Slack one more time. I think that's probably it. I think everybody knows Jordan's on vacation, so they're taking a vacation from office hours as well. I don't blame them. Yeah, so I think that'll be it for today. I'll be back tomorrow. I'll be a little more warmed up and ready to go. And yeah, so thanks everybody for tuning in, and I'll catch you tomorrow.